In the darkest corners of medieval cities, hidden beneath the bustle of crowded markets and the clang of blacksmiths' hammers, existed a world both feared and ignored. This was the realm of the Gong farmer. A man whose work kept the very foundations of civilization from collapsing into filth. A man whose job, as vile as it seemed, held the line between life and death. The term, Gong, was an old word for human excrement. It derived from the Old English gang, meaning to go. In a sense, a Gong farmer was a collector of all that had gone, all that society wished to forget once flushed into the shadows. In today's world of sewer systems and waste treatment plants, it's difficult to grasp the sheer scale of the problem faced in medieval times. People lived tightly packed within city walls. There were no flushing toilets, no septic tanks, and very few formal rules about hygiene. Waste from hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, would accumulate daily in outhouses, cesspits, or even directly in the streets. Left unchecked, these conditions became perfect breeding grounds for disease. Cholera, typhoid, the infamous plague, all spread rapidly through contaminated water and unsanitary living conditions. And so, despite the distaste of the work, someone had to remove the waste. That someone was the Gong farmer. He was not a glamorous figure. He did not wear fine robes or earn the praise of nobles. His name was not etched into illuminated manuscripts. And yet, his work was essential to the functioning of any medieval settlement that hoped to survive its own filth. Gong farmers were often required to work at night. Their tools were rudimentary: shovels, buckets, carts. And their task was straightforward but harrowing. They would descend into cesspits beneath privies, often standing waist deep in human waste, and begin scooping. The contents were removed by hand, loaded into barrels, and carted out of the city to be buried or, in many cases, sold to farmers as fertilizer. Thus, the Gong farmer played an unexpected role in the food chain. A grim middleman between the city and the countryside. In London, these workers were regulated by city law. By the 14th century, Gong farmers had designated areas outside the city where they were allowed to dump their loads. They were not permitted to work during the day. The stench alone could disrupt daily commerce and frighten passers-by. Gong farmers were sometimes employed by wealthy landowners, monasteries, or municipalities. Their earnings, while not princely, were not insignificant. In some cases, they were paid more than common laborers or even skilled tradesmen, a hazard pay of sorts for enduring the unbearable. But the job came at a cost. The social stigma attached to Gong farmers was immense. They were seen as unclean, not just in body, but in spirit. In some towns, Gong farmers were forbidden from entering churches during services. Others lived on the outskirts of town, isolated even from the communities they served. Despite the disdain, there were few willing to take their place. Without them, cities would drown in their own waste. Epidemics would spread faster. Rivers would be poisoned. Food would spoil. And so, whether people admitted it or not, they owed a great deal to the men with the worst job in the kingdom. The work was dangerous too. There are documented cases of men dying in cesspits, either from collapse, drowning, or toxic fumes. Methane and hydrogen sulfide, released from decomposing waste, could overwhelm a man in seconds. One misstep in the dark, and a Gong farmer could vanish, his body undiscovered for days. Such deaths were tragic. But to many in medieval society, they were also invisible. Who would mourn the loss of a Gong farmer? Who would write songs or carve memorials? And yet, some stories survived. One such tale comes from 14th century York. A Gong farmer named Thomas Barrow was said to have saved his entire district from an outbreak of the bloody flux, dysentery. While others fled, Thomas continued his rounds. He cleared out infected cesspits, disposed of waste properly, and advised townspeople to avoid certain contaminated wells. He was no physician, but he understood, better than most, where death came from. When the disease passed, fewer people had died in Thomas's quarter than in any other part of the city. Some say the mayor granted him a silver coin, a rare recognition of a Gong farmer's worth. Others say he was quietly dismissed, replaced with someone cheaper. History is unclear. But the story endures. And perhaps, that is enough. In many ways, the Gong farmer represented a contradiction. He was both necessary and reviled, trusted and shunned, a man who kept society clean while being treated as dirt himself. He was not alone in this strange paradox. Across the medieval world, there were many such figures, men and women who did what others would not. Their jobs seem strange now, even absurd. But in a world balanced on the edge of survival, they were nothing short of essential. And so we begin our journey into the strange, foul-smelling, yet fascinating world of the Middle Ages' most unsung workers. In the next part, we will dive deeper into the life of a Gong farmer. We'll walk a day in his boots, follow him into the darkness, and see, with eyes unclouded by modern judgment, what it truly meant to serve the people from beneath their feet. Nightfall in the medieval city was more than just a descent into darkness. It was a transformation. By torchlight and moonbeam, the world of the ordinary gave way to the extraordinary. Merchants closed their shops. Children were ushered inside. Church bells rang the curfew. And as silence crept across the cobblestones, the Gong farmers began their work. Their shift began when others' lives paused. For the Gong farmer, the night was both shield and stage. Shield, because daylight brought ridicule and protest. Stage, because in the absence of onlookers, he could move freely, unbothered by the disgusted stares of the public. The tools were simple: a shovel, thick gloves of leather, and a wagon fitted with large barrels. Some carried oil-soaked rags tied around their noses to dull the overwhelming stench. Others chewed mint or garlic to fight the nausea. But no preparation could truly shield them from what lay ahead. The Gong farmer's first stop was usually the public privy. In cities like London, these were known as jakes. They were communal toilets built over pits, often shared by entire neighborhoods. The deeper and older the pit, the worse the contents. Over time, these cesspits fermented into a hellish mixture of urine, feces, straw, blood, and rot. Descending into a cesspit was both a physical and psychological ordeal. The walls were often slippery, the bottom unstable. A misstep could plunge the worker into a mass of decomposition so thick it resisted movement like tar. The stench was nearly indescribable, a nauseating blend of decay, bodily waste, and chemical gases. Methane was ever present. In enclosed pits, it collected silently, invisibly, and could ignite with the strike of a torch. Stories of entire families perishing from a pit explosion haunted communities. Gong farmers, in particular, bore these tales as grim reminders of their fragility. One of the lesser-known dangers was the phenomenon called cesspit collapse. In some cases, the walls of a pit gave way under the weight of years of accumulated waste. The entire structure would fall inward, burying the worker alive in a slurry of filth. Rescues were rare. Few dared dig through human waste to retrieve a body. Still, the work continued. After the jakes came the private homes. Wealthier citizens had indoor garderobes, stone toilets built into castle or manor walls, their contents emptying into vertical shafts that led to small cesspools. These required narrower tools and great care, as collapsing an old shaft could destabilize an entire wall. Monasteries presented a special challenge. Their latrines, known as reredoors, were sometimes connected to running water systems. Gong farmers there were instructed not to damage the flow. Clerics demanded quiet, even at night. Thus, the Gong farmer's presence had to be felt but never seen. After collection, the barrels were sealed and loaded onto carts. The journey out of town was long and treacherous. Dogs followed the carts. Thieves avoided them. The Gong farmer made for the outer fields, where dumping grounds awaited. Sometimes he was met by farmers eager for fresh night soil. It was a strange exchange, money for manure, but one born of mutual dependence. The soil enriched by waste grew better crops. The crops fed the city. The cycle, as foul as it was, worked. In winter, the job became even more difficult. Waste froze in place, requiring chisels to remove. The farmer's hands, wet with filth, cracked and bled from the cold. But demand did not slow. Even in frost, the city produced its endless stream of excrement. Despite the dangers and revulsion, some Gong farmers took pride in their work. They knew its importance. A city without them was a city in crisis. And some earned enough to move their families out of poverty. But respect was hard won and rarely given. One account from Norwich in the 1300s tells of a Gong farmer named Willem Croak, who petitioned for safer working hours and a formal dumping site. His request was initially denied. But after a particularly harsh summer, when streets flooded with waste and disease surged, the city reconsidered. Croak was given a special license, a marked cart, and a small plot of land to manage waste disposal. He is one of the few named Gong farmers whose efforts were documented with praise. Children of Gong farmers often avoided following in their father's footsteps. The stigma was too heavy. Some changed surnames. Others joined guilds in faraway cities. Still, the job never truly disappeared. As long as there were people, there was waste. And as long as there was waste, someone had to carry it away. In fact, the Gong farmers' legacy can be found in modern sanitation work. Sewage systems may now be hidden beneath concrete and steel, but the principle remains unchanged. Sanitation saves lives. It preserves health. It sustains cities. And it started, in part, with men who shoveled human waste by lantern light. Their role was never romantic. But it was heroic in its own right. In medieval society, cleanliness was not merely a matter of comfort. It was a matter of survival. Before microscopes or germ theory, the only weapon against disease was removal. Out of sight, out of smell, out of the city. The Gong farmer was the first and last defense. But they were not alone in the world of strange and vital occupations. In Part 3, we will explore other bizarre professions that shaped the medieval world. From the sin-eaters who consumed the guilt of the dead, to the plague doctors with their beaked masks, we will unveil a hidden workforce of souls who bore the burdens no one else would. They too were strange. They too were essential. While the Gong farmer remains perhaps the most viscerally unpleasant of medieval workers, he was not alone in bearing the weight of society's darkest needs. Across Europe, strange and often misunderstood professions quietly ensured that the world kept turning. These jobs were rooted in superstition, necessity, and sometimes desperation. All were indispensable. Many were feared. Few were thanked. One such figure was the sin-eater. In parts of Britain and Central Europe, it was believed that a person's soul could not rest if they died with unconfessed sins. The church offered absolution, but not everyone could afford it, or died in time to receive last rites. For these unfortunate souls, a substitute ritual evolved. Enter the sin-eater. The sin-eater was typically a poor man or woman, often marginalized and seen as spiritually tainted. When a person died, bread and ale were placed on the corpse or passed over it in a ceremonial fashion. The sin-eater would consume the food, symbolically, eating the sins of the dead. In doing so, they absorbed the spiritual burden and allowed the deceased's soul to pass on in peace. It was a grim exchange. The sin-eater took a small coin for their trouble, and the weight of another's transgressions. Society viewed them with suspicion. To eat sins was to carry darkness. They were necessary, yet spiritually contaminated. No one wanted to befriend a sin-eater. And yet, when death came, people called for them. In a world governed by fear of damnation, the sin-eater provided an unsanctioned but emotionally vital service. They offered comfort to the grieving, and hope to the dead. Their existence reminds us how deeply medieval people feared the unknown after death, and how far they would go to cleanse the soul before it left the body. Another equally enigmatic job was that of the plague doctor. During outbreaks of the Black Death, cities summoned men to serve as plague doctors, a terrifying and symbolic figure. They wore long leather coats, gloves, wide-brimmed hats, and most notably, bird-like masks with long beaks. These beaks were stuffed with aromatic herbs, believed to purify the air and protect the wearer from miasmas, the foul, bad air, thought to carry disease. Most plague doctors had little to no formal training. Some were volunteers, others forcibly appointed. Their primary duty was to record deaths, treat the sick as best they could, and keep order in infected zones. They carried sticks to examine patients without touching them directly. They sometimes performed rudimentary surgeries, lanced buboes, or drained infected wounds. To many, plague doctors were figures of dread. Their appearance became an omen of death. Children fled from them. The sick feared them. And yet, their work, however ineffective by modern standards, was one of the earliest attempts at organized public health response. Many died. Few succeeded in saving lives. But their presence alone brought structure to chaos. The whipping boy was another unusual invention of medieval logic, born not from filth or disease, but from royal politics. In certain courts, it was considered unacceptable to physically punish a prince or noble child. Yet discipline was still required. And so, a surrogate was found. A boy of similar age, raised alongside the young noble, was designated to receive beatings on behalf of his royal companion. The idea was that the prince, feeling guilt for the punishment of his innocent friend, would change his behavior. Whipping boys often came from noble but lower-ranking families. They lived in the royal household, received education, and sometimes became close companions of future kings. Their emotional connection was crucial. Without it, the punishment was ineffective. This bizarre arrangement reveals the strange intersection of privilege, power, and punishment in medieval aristocracy. It was not the whip that tamed a prince, but the conscience. The practice fell out of favor in later centuries, but remains a haunting symbol of the lengths royalty would go to maintain dignity, even at the cost of justice. Among the most widespread, yet equally strange, professions was the rat catcher. In medieval cities, rodents were everywhere. They thrived in alleys, granaries, cellars, and under floorboards. They carried fleas, and with them, plague. They spoiled food and gnawed through walls. Rat catchers were hired to hunt them down, using traps, dogs, ferrets, or their bare hands. Some rat catchers were showmen. They staged public killings of rats to prove their skill. Others secretly bred rats to guarantee future work. The job was dirty, dangerous, and low in status. But during times of epidemic, rat catchers were suddenly in high demand. Their knowledge of rat behavior became a strange kind of science, long before disease transmission was understood. Many wore protective gear and carried special pouches of herbs. Some were even employed by city councils. In regions where the plague persisted for years, they became part of the public safety system. Despite the stigma, their contribution to urban survival was undeniable. Even in domestic life, odd roles appeared. The alewife was one such example. Brewing was a predominantly female occupation in the early Middle Ages. Women brewed ale at home, selling excess to neighbors or at markets. These women, known as alewives, wore tall hats and stood outside their homes with broomsticks tied to their doors, a sign that ale was ready. This imagery later fed into witch stereotypes, but at the time, they were respected providers. Alewives played a vital economic role. Ale was safer to drink than water in many towns. It provided calories, nutrition, and hydration. It was consumed by peasants, nobles, and clergy alike. Some alewives gained wealth and influence, running taverns and forming loose guilds. But they were also subject to suspicion. If a brew spoiled, or if a customer fell ill, blame fell on the brewer. Accusations of witchcraft often followed. The intersection of female enterprise and superstition made alewives both vital and vulnerable. Equally peculiar was the professional mourner, or keener. In Ireland, Scotland, and parts of France, families hired mourners, often women, to cry, wail, and chant during funerals. Their laments were dramatic, emotional, and public. The louder the mourning, the greater the honor paid to the deceased. In a world where death was omnipresent, professional grief became an industry. Keening was often passed down through families. Some mourners memorized ancestral verses or created personalized elegies for the dead. The church frowned upon the practice, seeing it as pagan and excessive. Yet it persisted for centuries, because it gave people a communal way to grieve. Their cries echoed through village streets, announcing loss. Their presence reminded everyone of mortality. They turned sorrow into ceremony. Each of these professions, strange by modern standards, filled a critical void in the medieval world. They addressed fears of death, sin, disease, vermin, and even divine justice. They performed tasks that others would not or could not do. They formed the hidden scaffolding upon which everyday life rested. What unites them is not just strangeness, but sacrifice. They gave of themselves, their dignity, their health, their souls, and sometimes their lives, to hold back the worst of what the Middle Ages could unleash. In Part 4, we will return to the Gong farmer and examine the long-term legacy of these medieval workers. How did their roles evolve? What lessons do they leave behind? And why, centuries later, do we still recoil in horror, even as we benefit from their forgotten labors? The Gong farmer, the sin eater, the plague doctor, the whipping boy. These titles seem foreign to the modern ear, like characters pulled from a grim fairy tale or a grotesque comedy. But these were real people, doing real work, and for centuries, they played indispensable roles in societies that were only beginning to understand the world around them. Their methods were crude. Their logic was often tangled with superstition, guesswork, and desperation. Yet the impact of their labor echoes even now, embedded in the very systems that govern our modern lives. The most visible legacy is sanitation. The Gong farmers' gruesome work laid the foundation for modern urban hygiene. As cities grew in size and density, the limitations of cesspits and night soil barrels became obvious. Outbreaks of cholera and typhoid in the 18th and 19th centuries forced governments to rethink waste management on a systemic scale. In London, the Great Stink of 1858, when the River Thames became so polluted with human waste that Parliament couldn't sit, triggered the construction of one of the first modern sewer systems. But before engineers and planners stepped in, it was the Gong farmers who managed the waste by hand, night after night. They taught cities, through their suffering, what filth truly cost. Today, we enjoy clean water, sewage treatment plants, and public health departments. But none of that happened overnight. It evolved over centuries. The roots of modern sanitation lie in the shovels and barrels of those grim workers, whose labor allowed civilizations to survive long enough to learn better methods. Their story is a reminder that even the most unglamorous work can be the most vital. The Sin Eater's legacy, meanwhile, is more spiritual than infrastructural. Their existence speaks to the profound human need for forgiveness, the desire to be cleansed of guilt, to leave no burden behind when facing the unknown. While the church formalized penance and absolution, the Sin Eater filled a folk religious gap, especially in isolated communities. In many ways, modern grief counselors, chaplains, and end-of-life care providers carry on this legacy. They guide the dying and comfort the bereaved. The Sin Eater may have acted from poverty, but the service they provided came from something deeply human, a recognition that death demands closure. The plague doctor, too, left behind more than eerie masks and fearsome legends. Though largely ineffective by today's standards, they were among the first to embody a professional, institutional response to disease. They took records. They enforced quarantine. They brought structure to panic. Their work foreshadowed the rise of epidemiology, quarantine policy, and public health intervention. Today, we have virologists, immunologists, and disease control agencies. Yet during every outbreak, from SARS to COVID-19, echoes of the plague doctor return. The mask may be gone, but the role remains. Even the whipping boy, strange as his function was, reveals how ideas of justice and education have evolved. The belief that a prince could not be punished taught us how deeply class and power affected accountability. It also showed that empathy could be used as a tool of instruction. Today, education emphasizes emotional intelligence, responsibility, and consequences rooted in understanding, not just fear. And what of the rat catcher? Their legacy is found in pest control, urban planning, and public health inspection. Modern cities employ entire departments to manage vermin. We track infestations, regulate food storage, and invest in buildings that discourage rats and mice. We now understand the link between rodents and disease. But that understanding began with men who crawled through cellars and listened for tiny claws in the dark. The alewife's story, though often overlooked, left behind more than beer. She challenged medieval gender roles. She ran businesses, managed supply chains, and built economic networks at a time when women were often excluded from commerce. Her hat and broomstick became symbols twisted by time, but they began as emblems of entrepreneurship and self-sufficiency. Today, women dominate parts of the craft brewing industry. Female brewers, distillers, and pub owners thrive in many countries. They stand on the shoulders of forgotten alewives, who brewed to feed their families and built reputations one cask at a time. All these strange jobs reveal a single truth. Every society has tasks it cannot live without, yet chooses to ignore. Those who do them are rarely honored. They are mocked, avoided, or pushed to the margins. But when crisis strikes, when the plague spreads, the toilets back up, or the rats overrun the town, it is to them we turn. The strange jobs of the Middle Ages remind us that civilization is not built only by kings, knights, or scholars. It is built, and maintained, by those who do the dirty work. It is tempting to view the Middle Ages as a time of ignorance and superstition. And in many ways, it was. But it was also a time of improvisation. People created roles, rituals, and responsibilities based on their understanding of the world. When no one else could solve a problem, someone stepped forward, even if it meant crawling into a cesspit, swallowing the sins of the dead, or wandering plague-stricken streets. There is dignity in that. Modern parallels abound. Sanitation workers, morticians, infectious disease researchers, pest control officers, hospice caregivers, all carry forward the spirit of those strange medieval jobs. Their tools have changed. Their titles have improved. But the core remains. They do what others will not. They protect us from the consequences of our own existence. In a world increasingly obsessed with fame, comfort, and instant gratification, the lessons of these ancient workers are worth remembering. True civilization is not measured by how clean its marble halls are, but by how well it treats those who clean them. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is not that the Gong farmer worked in filth. It's that he died in obscurity. So let us remember his story, and the stories of those like him. Let us honor their essential, strange, and often invisible labor. Let us teach their legacy, not as a footnote in a textbook, but as a testament to human endurance, humility, and the quiet strength required to keep a society standing. The strangest jobs of the Middle Ages were strange not because they were irrational, but because they made sense in a world of chaos. They were responses to need, not nonsense. They were ugly, but useful.